Start again. I'm Al Weinrub from the local Clean Energy Alliance, the coordinator. We're hosting this event, Clean Power Healthy Communities 2017. The reason we call it 2017, I mean, everybody knows what year this is, but this is number 6 for us, so it's a way of identifying, a series of conferences that we've been holding over the years to try to bring together the notion of clean power and healthy communities and what the relationship of all that is. How many people here were at the party last night? Raise your hands. All right. So for those who don't know, last year anniversary party, and we had a great time and a lot of conversations and drinking and eating and whatnot. And we still have part of the cake left over here, our 10th anniversary cake. It's sort of cut off a little bit, but it was like a 10th year happy birthday type cake, and it said clean power to the people on it, which of course is what we're all about. So please help yourself to cake at any time during the day and other snacks and whatnot. And for those who are in the room, the restrooms are through the door over here on my left in case you have that need. So I'm going to just do a little bit of introduction and framing for today, and then we're going to and walk you through the agenda a little bit, so everybody has an idea what we're about. We expect some people will be showing up a little bit later in the day as well. People come in and out, but we do appreciate everybody who's put aside the time to engage in these conversations. They've been very fruitful over the years in terms of building a movement to democratize energy, and we're going to talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about that. So, two things last night. It was not only the 10th anniversary of the local Clean Energy Alliance, and I would like to point out for those who are in the room, this timeline that's over here on my left here, which is 10 years. Of the work of the local Clean Energy Alliance, to give you all a sense of what we've been up to all this time. We're quite proud of our achievements over this period, and this marks a particularly important year because we have managed to finally succeed in setting up a community choice energy program in the East Bay. It's called East Bay Community Energy. Let's have a round of applause about that. 10 years in the making, and this we hope will change the whole texture of what energy looks like in our community and hopefully throughout the state as well. And we'll be having a breakout session this afternoon about it. But basically our work around building community choice energy programs is all what we see as changing the whole institutional structures by which communities decide what kind of energy they're going to be using and for what purposes, and who's going to control it and own it, and that's what we call democratizing energy. And so, so this is a major milestone for us as an organization. The other thing that's a major milestone for us and that we celebrated last night was the release of a new book. And strange as it might seem, this book is called Energy Democracy, again, but it's got an important subtitle to it, which is Advancing Equity in Clean Energy Solutions. And this is a hint to those of you who may not be familiar with the importance of the questions of social justice and the relationship to energy that the local Clean Energy Alliance stands for. So I think it's probably apparent to those who are aware political people now that that there is a very, very strong and direct relationship between the questions of racial justice and energy democracy, and that was made clear to all of us who might not have been aware of it before by the current inhabitor of the White House, who basically rode in on a program to destroy the earth based on a racialized appeal to the population. So it was a direct linking of the question of basically racial oppression on the one side and exploitation of the earth on the other side in a way that makes the world basically unlivable for everyone except the 1% and the people who own the energy establishment. So obviously the counter to that whole notion has to be a whole different political framing and a political strategy that recognizes how closely related the questions of social justice are to the questions of energy and to climate change, and then to the economic system in which we live. People, I'm sure, here, are familiar with Naomi Klein's book, which just came out at the time of our last conference in March of 2015. Her book about This Changes Everything, and it is a rethinking of the world that we live in and what we have to do to survive in this world, and it's very closely tied to the notion of being able to democratize the resources that we need to survive, and as people to be able to do that, and that really, any notion of democracy involves the notion of social justice and real equality, deep equality for all the people who live here. That's just a little bit of a framing for those. How many here have been to previous conferences of these? Oh, quite a few folks. Oh, that's a great sign. Well, thank you very much. So you already know the story in a certain way. So this is going to be an enrichment of that story. And for those that are new, welcome. And we hope that you find this to be sort of a challenging and provocative kind of discussion about where we have to go this year, next year, and in the years that follow. So I want to just take a minute with that introduction to walk through your program book for a moment. See if I can do this. Oh, I haven't been swallowing the microphone like I'm supposed to have been. I know you all can hear me. I hope that the folks Webcast can do so also. Just to take a look at the agenda. It's on the centerfold. So this is the opening up of the session, and then we're going to have our first plenary, which is going to be talking about national politics and sort of the whole national framing of our movement and what it's looking like these days and where we have to go. And then we'll have a little bit of a break and then talk about the local situation. So the theme of this conference is bringing energy to the movement for justice. So we want to talk about that at the national level, and we want to talk about that at the local level. And the thrust of our conference is going to be really about the local level, and we'll talk a little bit about this because that's really ground zero of building any kind of a movement. Then we'll have some lunch and a lot of time for people to talk and chat with each other. And we'll move into the afternoon, which will be breakout sessions. They're also listed in the book, and they're spelled out in some detail a little bit on the next page of your program. And you'll be able to choose 2 of those sessions that you can attend because we're going to run the same sessions twice. So you can be thinking about that. And also, in the back of the room, there are a bunch of descriptive boards out there that talk a little bit more about the details of those breakout sessions. So maybe during lunch, you might want to check that out as well. I want to just take a minute to give special thanks to the sponsors of Clean Power Healthy Communities 2017. They're all displayed on a couple placards in the back corner of the room. Please take a look at that. Over 60 organizations across the board, from public agencies to energy companies to social justice and allied organizations, and even some individuals have basically thrown in to help support this conference and the work of the local Clean Energy Alliance. So we definitely appreciate all of that. Let's see, what else? Any questions about what the day is going to look like? I don't know what I might have missed. I probably missed something. All right. Well, I think with that, I think we're ready to head into our first panel, maybe even a moment earlier. So our first panel today, we have some, we're really fortunate today to have some of the folks who've been very, very active in the national movement around climate change and around energy democracy, on the stage with me today. I'm going to allow them to pretty much give fuller introductions of themselves, just to take a second to do that, so that I don't misrepresent how anybody wants to be characterized to the rest of you. So we'll just, now these are not long discourses. These are just, hi, I'm Aiko, and so Aiko, would you mind starting and just say like what organization you're working with and just what your work is, just very, very briefly.
Happy to do that. Well, good morning, everyone. As Al said, my name is Aiko Schaefer, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I'm happy to be at a gathering that has birthday cake for breakfast. So that's kind of my kind of crowd to hang out with. So I coordinate the 100% network. It's an effort to really bring together environmental organizations, frontline communities, and intermediary organizations to really talk about ways in which we are moving forward an equitable transition to 100%. And so we work together to try to figure out how we center equity and justice in that work and to be able to elevate models and ideas that are working well across the country. So.
I'm Anthony Giancaterino. I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I am currently doing a fellowship out of the Movement Strategy Center, looking at just community energy transition work, both at a national level, but also some organizing and kind of deeper work in Philadelphia and PA. And I get to work with Aiko too, which is always fun.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to California, for those of you coming from outside of California. My name is Strella Service. I'm the statewide organizing director with the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Woo-woo! I see some people. So we are a statewide coalition of environmental justice base building organizations. I see some of our members in the room. Poder, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Communities for a Better Environment. So we're made up of 10 member and partner organizations across the state, and we represent around 30,000 working class people of color. And our role has really been to bring grassroots statewide policy up to the national scene and to really center that around environmental justice and equity and really to help lead the environmental justice movement in California and then potentially the nation as well.
Great, and people are, I'm sure, have probably touched base in one way or another with the work of all three of these folks, even maybe if it's not explicitly in your mind that that's who they are. So thank you so much. Now, as a good moderator, I went and what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation up here this morning, and it's going to be based around a number of questions which I drew up to present to the panel. And of course, I don't have the set of questions on me because, you know, being that there's a lot going on, I happen to have left it somewhere. But I have a pretty good idea of what we're going to talk about, and I'll probably get some help here from the folks up on the stage. But I know that that for sure what we wanted to do is to, you know, get a little bit of a sense of, you know, nationally when we start talking about, you know, the movement and the movement to transition to 100% renewable energy. Like, so what does that look like? You know, what's the current moment that we're in terms of, you know, the Trump administration and the climate justice movement and whatnot? And so maybe we can start with a, you know, a discussion about just what the national framing looks like. What's the issue? How do we look at the issue? How do we define the issue that we're dealing with today? Somebody want to start off with that?
I'll start off. Thank you. So the moment we're in didn't start in January, and it didn't start in November 8th. It actually started prior to that. It just, what the election helped kind of unveil was what's been happening for a very long time, but we've kind of hidden under a carpet and kind of avoided having to talk about because things were kind of quote unquote being progressive. So the moment really is a deeply anti-racist, anti-black, and anti-brown kind of frame for and moving in a world of scarcity. So we're always trying to fight each other for significant resources that are limited and trying to kind of one up on each other over time. When the administration kind of came in, we saw like a series of constant assaults and attacks on almost every single issue that was targeting black and brown communities. From the NFL, going after Colin Kaepernick and NFL players for protesting, to actually kind of steamrolling folks' voices around healthcare to this current tax bill. There's this constantly always in this fight mode. And part of that is, I think a lot of it is ill will, a lot of it is out of a lot of spite, but it's also in ways to help kind of divide and conquer communities. If you constantly kind of attack on multiple fronts, people are torn in different fronts. And very quietly, in the conversation around energy, things have been moving at a very drastic pace nationally around unveiling and rolling back a lot of energy efforts that are supposed to be advancing something that's much more sustainable. Nationally, Secretary of State, as you know, was at ExxonMobil. The head of the EPA sued the EPA multiple times when he was in Oklahoma. So those are kind of the top level, really explicit attacks on environment and sustainability. But at a much more kind of level that's played out in multiple states that happened nationally was this deep tie around energy and race. And so I'm from Pennsylvania, and during the election, I started reading a lot of then candidate Trump's campaign speeches in Central PA. And he would focus all of them around coal and natural gas and jobs, constantly. I'm going to return these jobs. I'm going to return coal. We're going to do more drilling. This was a constant refrain. But he couched all of that in attacks on people of color. So he would open up talking about how the city's quote-unquote code for black and brown were a drain on rural and urban communities. They are wanting to see their communities shut down. They want to see their coal plants shut down. He would open that up talking about that. He would then talk about wanting to return, quote unquote, these jobs to these communities. And then he would close by talking about, again, they're a drain, they're just a drain, they're a drain. And so there was this vision of people of color being a drain on the system that was being talked about explicitly, but not so explicitly that you would automatically identify, oh, he's being really racist or he's pushing a white nationalist framework, because it was couched within this, like, well, I'm about energy. I want to create jobs for your community. I want to create this opportunity for your community to survive. But it was really clear. It was like your community being white, rural community. What gets missed in all of that narrative is then we responded on the left as we got to organize white folks in rural communities now so that we can win in the 2018 election. And that's actually I would argue that's the wrong approach to change. Because what happened is we're just constantly pitting each other, and there's no kind of relationship building across the multiple geographies, urban, rural, or suburban. And we're actually not really thinking about shifting the narrative. So working class, I really appreciated when Strella said she's working with communities to build a working class people of color. There are so many people of color are working class communities, and that narrative got shifted off. There are people of color who are working in industries that are impacted by fossil fuel and energy, who are trying to build renewable energy, and they can't get in because labor unions sometimes don't let them in because of pipeline challenges. And so a lot of the context has really been about how do we kind of continually support this framework that is really anti-racist, and using energy is one of the ways to organize around that. I'll just kind of turn.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I think the other thing that's happening nationally since the elections is, this narrative of taking away from people of color, taking away resources, the narrative around you don't have the right to certain things, and that connected to energy is very explicit to us because energy is about shifting resources and shifting the economy. And what we've worked so hard for in the movement around energy democracy is not just about energy policy necessarily, but it is about this intervention of how do you really shift the economy in a way that benefits the people. So it has forced us to really look at how we do our organizing and movement building in a much more aggressive way, and also to partner with organizations and other social justice movements and labor in a much more intentional and different way. Not that we haven't been doing that historically, because we've all been doing the hard work of that, But after the election, for example, we were getting so many different phone calls from all kinds of allies that traditionally haven't been, calling us up, and our social justice allies as well, that we haven't been working with in the environmental justice movement to kind of link arms and work to move forward together. The other piece that I will say is that it's exhausting. It has forced us to, double down on our work in a setting where our tendency is already to overwork ourselves in this movement, and just the sheer exhaustion of being hit on a daily basis with a number of different onslaught of policies that have reneged or taken away some of the progressive policies that we've actually built over the years.
Yeah, thanks. Aiko, is this ringing true to you?
It is an interesting conversation already. I think the other thing I would add is, on Strella's point in terms of, I think, movement building and energy and engagement happening locally, that nationally there was a pivot away from Washington, D.C. So when I started working in the network in the summer of 2016, we were seeing national organizations in Washington, D.C. getting prepared and aligned for a Clinton administration, with hopes that that administration would carry forward a lot of our hopes in energy policy, or rather the traditional environmental hopes around energy and climate policy. And so as Trump was elected, a lot of the organizations in Washington, D.C. then were pivoting out of that work and recognizing that the work that they that could happen would be at the state level. And I think local level, but definitely the state level. And so you had national environmental organizations in particular who are highly resourced and highly focused in Washington, D.C., pivoting and looking at the states and trying to figure out which states would be the opportunity to push forward an energy agenda. And while I think that that is a smart strategic decision, because I agree that the states are where work can happen, the difficulty is that it has the possibility of bringing in another player into state spheres and local spheres who have not been there, who are highly resourced and have very particular agendas that have been evolved from a national lens. And so I think in the work that I do around state level policy in Washington State, where I'm based, it just brings in another player who perhaps is not quite as well versed or quite as connected, who wants to engage in these spaces. And so from an environmental justice perspective and this deeper analysis about the intersectionality of energy and racism, the community groups who are leading and should be leading, I would argue, in this space, have a sort of a more well-funded and connected entities kind of coming on the stage. And so at times it is more difficult in terms of the collaboration that we need to be fostering and the ability to really build a shared movement. And so, so there's the positive side of the grassroots work. I think there is a positive side to the national groups coming into the space. The question is how that actually happens.
Well, you actually, you mentioned about the national groups and whatnot, which sort of gets us into, the question about like the organizing, that's going on and what different national organizations are doing in the situation that we're talking about now. I think people might know that Bill McKibben just recently has been putting out some, positions for 350.org, that are very strongly about, okay, the way I interpret them is that, well, before we were all about, 350 being an important number because that's, that's the level of parts per million that we can tolerate in the atmosphere and stuff like that. And now there's a new number, and that new number is 100%, right? And so we're all about 100% renewables, 100% renewables, 100% renewables, and oh yeah, by the way, people of color also should be involved in this 100. They should also have access to 100% renewables. So it's sort of like, this sort of consumerist notion that you have a market, it's a 100% renewables market, and we want to make sure that people of color also are part of that market because after all, they're half the people in the country. What would you do? Anyway, that's a little bit of a trashing Bill McKibben's statement, right? But I mean, it's to me, it's really important. Like that's an organization. It's a well-known organization. It's a national organization, and they're basically taking a political position that reduces the whole question that we're talking about to a technical question about, well, is it renewable or is it carbon? Right. Anybody want to?
I'm happy to jump
okay.
in here. I think that there are good intentions from the standpoint that, with Trump in the White House, there is a deep desire to show that people care deeply about climate and care deeply about renewable energy and all the things that you all care about in this audience. And in order to do that, there is a active focus around winning. And this drive to show wins, to show that people care deeply about this issue, has a urgency to it. And so I think when you have this recipe of an active, concerned base of people who want to engage meets desire to show the president and his base that we care about climate, meets an easier approach policy-wise, meaning let's focus on setting a target that is way down the road, then that combination is fueling this energy that doesn't recognize the deep and intentional work that has to happen in community and building relationships, in particular with communities of color, and also recognizing their knowledge and experience and thoughts around what those solutions should be. So I do agree, that this is where we are, and that I think that 350 and other groups are in this space. I think that they're, like I said, good intention, but I think that if we go down that path, for those of us who care about justice and equity, the danger, right, is that you have a policy that overlooks us entirely at worst, and at best only focuses on access. And my analogy to folks recently was the conversation we used to have about the digital divide, right? And the solution to the digital divide was, we'll just find really wealthy philanthropists that will buy a bunch of computers for poor schools in our neighborhoods, right? And suddenly the divide has been solved. I mean, we are positioning ourselves for an energy divide. And so our solution can't be to just figure out ways where people could afford a solar panel or electric vehicle, but I think what the book raises, what the conversation today is, we're talking about a structural transformation. So to get to that level of change requires us to have deep transformative approaches and deep and transformative relationships.
All right, we got some fingers on that one, yeah. Well, Anthony and Strella, what do you folks think? Is that about right?
Yes, I would fully agree. I think one of the things that we were talking, and like I was talking about too, is like, so if you're using an equity and justice frame, like that can't be an add-on or an extension to what's already working. So we're seeing a lot of this now, that a lot of groups are saying, oh, we have to talk about equity because you need to talk about equity, which is great. It's like, yes, you need to talk about equity. Yes, we need to talk about racial justice, but it can't be done as a side, like a condiment on a menu, on your dinner plate. It can't be like the ketchup or the mustard that you just put on. Like, it's got to be the meal. Like, the meal has to be equity and justice. And if you take that analysis, which is, yes, a lot longer work, very transformative, requires a lot of intentionality, it's painful, but if we do it, we're going to come up with solutions that are actually going to get to the systems and structural change that Iko talked about. Otherwise, we could technically have a 100% renewable city that still leaves people getting their energy shut off. So what good was the transition if people still can't afford to be able to keep their homes cool or hot in the winter and the summer? What good is an energy transition if you have no say or control over your utility bill and one corporation continues to control all those resources? Cleaner air, yes, very important. Good for the earth, yes. But if we're going to continually extract, what are we doing to each other as humans too? So we need something that's much more holistic, that's looking at humanity and the earth together, and a much more ecological framework, and one that really shifts it through a deeper equity and justice framework, and then we could get different solutions.
Yeah, like that. And the example in California where the governor threw people of color under the bus recently. What about that one?
He definitely did throw people of color under the bus. So I think what's exciting about the California example, and everybody's sort of looking to California as a model state, because we've been in the trenches and doing this kind of work where when I first started at CEJA, actually, we didn't have an energy program. And we've had to do the hard work of really aligning and making the connections for people around energy and race, right? And so it's, and also doing all the really, really challenging organizing work that is entailed with all of that, from developing curriculum, going to the different communities, training people, doing all kinds of work in multilingual, culturally appropriate types of curriculum and training, and then organizing and mobilizing people up to the state capitol so that they're comfortable and empowered to put out their vision for what energy democracy and energy equity actually looks like through state legislation, right? And so what's happened in California is, the governor, as we know, recently released and passed this extension of cap and trade, and not only threw us under the bus, but also set us down a journey of potentially increasing the public health impacts and then essentially killing environmental EJ communities while in the process of doing that. And so what's important in that is that what we need to do in terms of aligning not just ourselves but our allies in moving forward, right? The lesson learned there is that even though we need collaboration, that sometimes our allies will also throw us under the bus. And in that moment around extension of cap and trade, a lot of our allies were actually on the wrong side, except one big green, which was the Sierra Club. And there were others that also took a bold position to oppose it, but the Sierra Club I really want to mention, because in this context, in your question around 350.org and what Big Greens are doing, I really want to put forward an example where a partnership between the big Environmental Justice Coalition in California, which is CEJA, and the Sierra Club have been working in partnership together. So the Sierra Club and CEJA actually went on a dating process where we took several years to form a formal partnership together, because we knew that we couldn't alone, with just CEJA's 10 members and partners, win around energy democracy, as well as the Big Greens can't win alone by themselves, and that they really need EJ. But it can't just be token, right? And so they really took it upon themselves to center themselves around equity and have really hard conversations internally. And all of that's really long, hard work, and it took many years. But it resulted in one positive outcome, which is they actually ended up being on the right side and opposing cap and trade. So I just want to put that forward, because a lot of people in this nation are really looking for models, positive models, where environmental justice and big enviros can actually work together. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying that there's not more work to be done, but it is a model.
And I think probably part of the message also is that, if we're trying to build a movement that can really move things, then it's not going to happen if there's two different pieces to it, right? The white piece and the people of color piece. So, even for organizations that might not get the centrality and the essence of what basing energy policy on social justice means in a deep sense, on a practical sense, there's no way to build a movement unless those organizations align themselves with the broader needs of people of color, right? And I think, it's to Sierra Club's credit that it has moved in that direction. I should say that they sponsored our conference this year, which is really great, you know, and that's probably another indication of a sensitivity and a willingness to move on this issue. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done amongst other organizations, like in the case of California, the NRDC and EDF, and like a lot of the big ones. I mean, they were right there with the governor, and they're still with the governor around a number of other policies. I just wanted to say, if I could take a moment, that you know, it's really a question of what energy policies look like, you know, on a very kind of deep level. Like in the state of California right now, I mean, we just had an experience of a bill that was put forward, 762, and it was a bill all about regionalizing our energy market. You know, California has an energy market, and the whole idea of regionalizing the energy market. And you know, the governor pushed this, the NRDC pushed this, and this is essentially a disaster for our communities. And you know, I mean, everybody doesn't quite get that yet, but it is pretty clear that if you really want to talk about local organizing and local building and localization of energy policy, regionalization is on the other side and in the other direction and whatnot. So the whole shaping of California state policy at a very fundamental level revolves around questions of race, whether it's obvious or not obvious. And you know, so it's deeper. It's a very deep question because it's fundamental questions of policy and how the energy systems get shaped at a fundamental level, like we talk about really democratizing energy. Okay, I need to be closer to the microphone. So I'm not going to repeat all that, sorry, but anyway, I mean, I think it suggests maybe pushing into like to the next arena, which is like, okay, what does our positive alternative start to look like? I mean, what is the alternative to the, you know, very strict and constrained 100% renewable, you know, just transition to renewable energy look like in terms of the kinds of frameworks we put forward, in terms of the type of activities we engage in terms of the type of policies that we push for. Somebody want to move in that direction a little bit?
And your question more is about the movement building part or about the
No,
policy
more about,
ideas?
well, it's more, yeah, well, it's partly about the moving building part, but it's like, what's our, you know, strategy then? And how does that strategy, you know, manifest itself in terms of how we go about doing our work?
Great. You know, I think for me, my perspective and, you know, talking with the panelists, that everyone is touched by energy. Right? I mean, everyone has a relationship to the topic in different ways. And so it is a place for us to find common ground and for us to be able to come together. I think that we also need to think about these issues as big. And that's counterintuitive to the traditional approach to policymaking, is that we tend to think about policymaking as narrow, as winnable, and as highly technical. And through that, we tend to position ourselves to be less able to build a movement. The idea of a movement is about transformation. It's about big, bold vision, big, bold solutions. And within that, you can have smaller pieces, but I think we often get so focused on the tiny technical elements, which then really ice out a conversation about the structural nature of what we need to do. So for example, when you think about the civil rights movement, right, the notion of civil rights was something that for African Americans and Americans broadly was the hope, could understand the notion of civil rights. That was big and that was bold when that conversation was happening. And there were smaller, more focused campaigns that elevated the notion of civil rights. But those smaller elements were framed in a larger, bolder vision. And unfortunately, the way that we approach the work now is only doing the smaller, narrow, winnable technical things and not putting forward the bolder, harder vision that will take time, that through it drives deeper conversations and a shared analysis about what's wrong and what we need to do. And so I do think that if we can get to that place, we have the opportunity to have conversations with more people. We have the ability to allow people to feel like they can be experts in that because it's their personal experience. They don't have to have an advanced degree to talk technically about energy. Because the downside of energy, much like what we've done with climate, is you can make it so technical that it makes people feel like they don't really understand it. So there's an opportunity to really position us in a way that makes it connect with people and for us to be able to talk to people from where they're at.
So Aiko spoke about the civil rights movement, and when CEJA sponsored our first bill in California, which was called Solar for All, and we were, women of color, mostly women of color, going around the Capitol, sort of like newbies, trying to tout this thing called Solar for All. We were actually trying to frame it as this is the new civil rights movement with people. Because it's not just about solar and slapping some solar panels on some rooftops, right? But when you think about it, what we were putting forward was really looking at communities that have been incredibly under-resourced and neglected by our government and historically. And you're looking at communities that have been living and breathing next to dirty power plants and oil refineries and expanding freeways and whatnot. And they themselves are putting out their own vision for a clean, renewable energy future that they could own themselves, right? That they could get jobs from, that they could build their own economy with. So there's so many different pieces of it, and it was led by people of color. So that essentially to us was is not just like this small solar pilot program that we were going around and advocating for, but it's really a big paradigm shift that was really centered around race and equity. And with that, communities that are most impacted by the fossil fuel industry and dirty energy have a wide spectrum of barriers and challenges in terms of making that shift to 100% renewable energy. And CEJA is completely supportive of 100% renewable energy. To your previous question, that's something that we've been trying to work towards. But our main question within that is, where's the equity piece within that? You can't just have 100% renewable energy and then have all of that renewable energy infrastructure be out in the desert and not have any of the improved public health benefits or any of the local economic and jobs benefits right in the local communities. So where's the equity within that, and where are the benefits within that? And so our approach has been, whether or not you call it 100% renewable energy, it's multi-pronged and it's comprehensive because our communities experience a variety of challenges that cannot be addressed by just one policy mechanism, but a myriad of different policy solutions.
Anthony, your thoughts?
Yes, I agree again, always with Aiko and Strala.
This is getting boring. Everybody agrees with everybody
it's
out
easy
here.
to follow.
Can somebody disagree? Go ahead.
But I would say, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about too is, and so I do a lot of work with a group in Philadelphia called Power. No pun intended, or maybe pun intended, I'm not sure. But so Power, though, has been working around, very explicitly as a racial justice organization, and they got into climate and energy through a job framework. And as we've been building this work out, it became very clear that people didn't have enough time to be able to vision and dream and go big. Because it's constantly a fight. So it's like we're fighting to end mass incarceration. We're fighting to get, which is exciting, a DA who's actually ran on an ending mass incarceration campaign get elected. We're fighting to end cash bail. We are trying to make sure that people don't get kicked out of their homes. We're trying to stop gentrification. We're trying to make sure that there's fair education funding. Like the list goes on. And people are always constantly fighting that they don't actually have time to think about like the vision on what they want to be able to see and to be able to go bold. And so the default then ends up being, we'll leave it to the technical experts, we'll leave it to the people who have these ideas. And that's playing out not just in energy, the idea of like jobs and how do we actually create these opportunities. Right now Philadelphia is bending over back to get Amazon's second headquarters. And it drives me nuts that we have a city of leaders who are willing to sell out the city for 50,000 jobs. The big question for who are those jobs actually for what residents? What's it going to do for housing and displacement? What's it going to do for the region? And all these questions aren't really being asked. It's kind of taken for granted that, oh, they'll be fine because Amazon's going to save us and create all these jobs and invest in our city. Not to mention that the city would give millions and billions of dollars of tax breaks to Amazon. So what good is that actually doing to build the support for the city? So with power, we've been talking, and this going to the national context, this is happening, I think, in lots of different places. We're talking about how do we actually build kind of regional power, urban, rural, suburban. So we're seeing, people coming back into the city centers, mostly white, wealthier folks, people look like me, coming back into the cities, living there, displacing people back into the suburbs. We don't have infrastructure to actually serve the suburban communities. And so what does it actually mean to be building an energy transition then, where you're actually uniting urban, rural, suburban communities together as a whole kind of regional approach? That then you could actually build power and take on a corporation, or you don't have to worry about kind of bending over back for the next Koch brother venture to come in and provide these quote unquote mysterious jobs that never seem to last. So that's just something we've been thinking about is like, how do we actually build across those lines? And that again takes a lot of depth and time. And how do you do that while holding that big vision and also understanding the reality of like people that we're working with need to find food today to survive. And so that we haven't been able to figure out that balance, but how do we balance that? Like the immediacy of the now, which usually comes with short-term solutions, which really aren't great long-term wise, versus the long-term vision that we want to see as a more just world.
Yeah, it's a tricky, it's a tricky business, and I was just thinking that when we talk about empowerment, I mean, you use the word power, right? Because empowerment, we're talking about electricity or energy or whatnot, but empowerment has a much more fundamental kind of notion to it in terms of political and economic empowerment. I just wanted to point out one of the things that's distinctive about the East Bay Community Energy Program that we set up on the East Bay, in the East Bay here. The community had basically two demands. One is that the program be able to provide, through the development of local energy, real concrete economic benefits to the community through jobs and investment in the community, and through wealth staying within the community from the harnessing of electrical energy and so on and so forth. But the other demand was the demand for community engagement in the formation and the design of the program itself. And so, and that's the other empowerment, the empowerment of the community. And and through that organizing that took place, we're able to, either convince or force the political powers to put on the governing board of this Joint Powers Authority that runs the agency, a community member. Even though California state law says that JPA boards have to be made up of electeds and so on and so forth, but that was really about who has voting power. But what we managed to get set up here in the East Bay was a community advisory committee, and there was a lot of interest in that, and it's a very powerful committee, but the chair of that committee actually sits on the governing board. And, to tell you the truth, it's not the vote that counts because it's 1 of 12 votes. But the recommendations of the Community Advisory Committee have been basically what framed and shaped the direction of that program for the last few months. So that's that notion of empowerment whereas it's basically for the community to understand that it is our energy, right, and it is our resource, and that broader vision has to be one of shifting from sort of a commodity base and a consumerist base to one of being, really the direction of things to go. So we're beginning to get some questions, but I want to hold the questions for just a little bit, and we're going to basically open it up to try to have a little bit more of a discussion here. But I did want to, so these are broad strategic frameworks, and thank you very much. I mean, I think this is at the heart of the way we have to start transforming our thinking in order to transform the nature of the system, for sure. But wanted to say, like, what indications you had from your work that there is, on a national level, an emerging movement to democratize energy that maybe we didn't see a year and a half or 2 years ago. Any indications or hope you have that things are moving in that direction? Yeah,
I can start. So I'm going to talk about California and its implications around the nation.
Well, all eyes are on California.
All
so
eyes
go
are on
for it.
California. And so I'm going to start by saying, you asked Al if one of us could disagree, so I'm going to disagree a little bit with you, actually,
Great, oh wait.
and say that around the world or in the nation, there might not be an energy democracy movement. Might not be. Within California and within this room and the people that are doing this work on a day-to-day basis, and maybe even within the environmental justice movement and the social justice movement more so, we are in a bubble, I feel like. And I think that we feel like we are in a movement around energy democracy and energy equity because we're doing the work on a day-to-day basis and because we have seen so much progress in California. Again, like I said when earlier that when we first started this work, we didn't even have an energy program. We had to start our energy work on within ourselves. And when we first started advocating for and equitable energy policies in Sacramento, in the capital, nobody knew what the heck we were talking about around like how do you connect equity and energy, right? And how do you center people of color within that? We had to do that work for people. And so because it's taken all of the organizing work and the movement building work that people don't understand or didn't understand and still don't understand, a lot of our allies and people around us don't understand it. But we understood it. We've allowed to make that shift happen in California. So we have been leading the environmental justice movement that is people-centered, and then within that, an equitable energy that is people of color-centered. And so what does that look like within energy policy? Well, that can look like things that we just passed more recently, like AB 693, which puts solar on multifamily affordable housing. That was the big win that we had. That was essentially what our first bill was, which was Solar for All, and it's the largest investment of renewable energy in environmental justice communities, $1 billion over 10 years. That can look like shared solar, but with a particular focus on prioritizing environmental justice communities. That can look like also fighting the bad stuff. So we always have to put out the vision of what we want, but at the same time, even in California, where we've kicked out coal, essentially, the whole narrative is, okay, let's turn to natural gas. And so we are constantly fighting this big build out of natural gas power plants. So a positive indicator is we've, along with one of our partner organizations, the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy cause, based in Oxnard, a heavily environmental justice people of color community, have been fighting a multi-year campaign against the fourth power plant that is being proposed by Energy and Edison. And we are on the brink of winning that campaign. Decision's gonna come out pretty soon. We're all, anxiously awaiting that. But it really took so much work, and I have to just do a special shout out to the youth, people of color, youth of color in that region, because they're really the ones that led that movement. And we're there, mobilizing 200, 300 people in these hearings in Oxnard on a year-to-year basis, and doing all kinds of creative arts and cultural work there to make that happen. So that's one big indicator, and we are seeing a lot of the regulatory agencies and even legislators saying that it's time now to transition away from natural gas.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing it emerge with a broader emergence of this idea of democratizing resources, and I feel like the movement is around democratizing resources. I just want to. Last night, Vivian talked about no idea is a new idea. It just comes out in different ways, and I feel like the conversation around energy democracy is really not so much a new idea. We're just kind of almost returning back to principles of what it means to be good to each other and good to the planet. But I'll do a quick shill to the book. The book actually has models and examples, which I highly recommend people taking a look at it. But in the book, there's actually examples of where this is
they
happening.
can do more than take a look at it. I mean,
And
it's going to be actually,
by-
it's going to be available, at
Available
the
on
back
the back.
table.
So in there's really great stories that are really critical that I think show the emergence of energy democracy taking place. And I think we're seeing more and more of that scaling out across the country. But I would posit that is actually within a broader sense of, and now kind of to the story you just talked about with the East Bay advisory, like people are pushing and moving for democratizing resources and control and revenue, whether it's water, whether it's looking at land and energy as right or as commons. And then also around governance, and actually, how do you take back governance? Because it's clearly out of whack. As we all can see, the system is out of whack. And even people who are supposed to be representing us, who are more aligned in vision and values, are also out of whack. And so there's been a big move, I think, to kind of redemocratize or retake over our governance structures and the resource structures. And within that, energy is probably one of the most critical elements of that, because without energy, nothing really can move. And so if you can engage in the energy conversation and question, you can actually shift a lot of that.
Heiko, you're ready to say something. Please do.
I, without hesitation, say the answers to the question of whether or not we have a national movement on energy. I don't hesitate to say we don't. I think that, so let's talk a little bit about how we get there and sort of what it will take. And I think that Strella's example and Anthony talking about this work, there's work happening locally. So what's essential to building a movement is that it's ground up, that it comes from local communities, that the groups that are doing extraordinary work and leading that work, like Seha, that they're leading. So we know that it needs to be ground up. And we know that for it to be transformative, that it has to be frontline led. And so those are the two elements that I think are important to building a national movement. Then there are other elements about how do movements get formed. And the way in which that work happens, right, is that we are organizing and organizing and organizing, which a lot of the resources that are out there in this space are not organizing dollars. And they certainly aren't organizing resources that go to local groups. So the idea is that you're organizing in communities. In addition, you're doing deep education. And again, I don't think that we're doing that work as well across the board and people who work in this space. And education that really connects with people and where they're at and how they think about these issues. Again, kind of not the deep technical education about how energy grids work, but rather the deep analysis and meaning and relevance about this issue. So in my opinion, and a lot of people, this is the thinking about how movements are, how they begin, is that there's the organizing and the educating, and then there is at some moment an event that begins to propel everything that you said as an example and puts it into people's mind's eye. I would argue that we have these, what are often termed trigger events, happening every single day. There are forest fires, there are floods, there are storms, there are oil spills. There are moments in which either, Mother Nature in her wisdom and or man-made examples come forward in which people at home who are not here with us today, but folks who maybe are not thinking about this issue yet, suddenly hear a story that they can feel some sense of connection and concern for. And so the challenge is that, I'll start with the opportunity. The opportunity is that, again, energy touches everybody's lives in all sorts of ways, in real tangible daily ways, whether you're trying to figure out how you're going to put gas in your tank to get to work or get to your second job and your third job, whether or not you can turn on your electricity and heat your house, all sorts of simple daily ways. And so for us, it's being able to honor the leadership of frontline communities and to put them front and centered in the work, and to be able to continue to organize and educate. And when those moments arise, help people connect the moment that they are being exposed to the deeper narrative and the deeper work that has to happen. And so doing that work, which we've done as a nation, right? That's what we did. That's what happened. Not we did, because I was going to say what we did in the 60s. I was alive in the 60s, but not old enough to be organizing yet. But when you look at the 60s and 70s, that was how the work happened. We sort of went away from it and went through a theory of change, which was, well, the smartest idea wins. So we went more to the let's invest in the research and the technical policy development and trying to figure out, well, how can we design this in a way that, I just put my finger in the air, the wind is blowing this way, let's go ahead and do a policy that's got a high poll rate, we're going to go over here. And I remind people that if Dr. King had done a polling on whether or not civil rights was popular, we'd never have civil rights, right? You got to do the deep work and the organizing that builds movements. And so I think that it's an issue of resources. It's our shared theory of change. But I think the upside is that we could build a national movement. And I do think that there is a desire for that in the local communities.
Great. Well, I think what we want to. All right, let's give a. That's for you, Aiko, and also for the rest of the folks, because we're now going to try to open up, to questions and thoughts that you have. We do have, for folks that are in the room, we have a microphone here, and people can line up at the microphone. We want to make the questions short, or people can make a comment too, but. Try to engage everybody, and we have also some folks on the line as well who are on the webcast who have some questions too. So let me just check on what the queue online looks like for a second.
So we have two questions. One is speaking towards alternative cap and trade.
Okay.
The other one is explaining what you mean by tangibly about movement building around energy policy. So for example, what exactly led up to the community choice aggregation, basically an anti-capitalist watershed win? How do you do that?
Okay, well, you all didn't hear that, but those are some heavy questions. I'll try to integrate them in. But let's take one first on the floor. And there's 4 people lined up, so quick if you can.
Before Jerry.
State your name, please. Just
Okay. I'm Reverend Earl Coteen. I'm with Sunflower Alliance and several other organizations. Before Jerry threw us under the bus, he threw us under the truck with SB1 and the exemption for freight. I have come to believe that all our justice work really has to become much more political, and I want to know what you're doing in that way to register voters or do other actions that might give us the power, political power, we need to make a difference.
I can speak to that.
Yeah, go ahead. I just maybe I thought we could have a couple questions first, so then people can address maybe a couple of concerns at one time. Okay, how do we build up political power and voting power? Go ahead.
I'm Zoe Elizabeth, and I'm with EcoShift Consulting. We're part of the team that's doing the local development business plan, looking at economic and environmental benefits that can come out of CCA, specifically in Alameda County. My comment is first, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I would love to talk with all of you for hours. And I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question that's been really on my mind. It's kind of big picture, but it's this connection between the local democratization of power and an eventual national movement, right? And so there's a bit of a technology issue here, but it's also really about process and the movement. So there's going to be some local communities that have an abundance of renewable energy. There's going to be some local communities that have a dearth of renewable energy. Well, right now, a lot of the movement for local power is starting in communities with an abundance of renewable energy. So how do we make sure that those local movements don't leave out future communities by consuming all of that power, investing in technologies that maybe benefit that local community, but again, leave out future national communities. So how do we keep this local movement connected to a larger national movement?
Great. Okay, now I can see that adding a bunch of questions is going to be problematic because these are all these are our weighty questions, right? And it's hard to intermix. So thank you for the question. So let's first talk about. Well, so there's two questions on, and let's see if people want to address either one of them. But Strella, you were going to go after the question of political power at the voting booth, and then we'll talk. Go ahead, just do that.
Sure. Yes. Thanks for the question. So absolutely, we recognize that we need to build our political power, especially amongst people of color in California. And so CEJA has a C4, CEJA Action, that is relatively new. We launched it in 2015. But because of that, we've been able to engage in electoral politics in a much more deeper and meaningful and strategic way. And what I mean by that is we are now better able to connect and coordinate across our member and partner organizations to build a more comprehensive program, electoral program, to take on ballot initiatives and then elect progressive candidates in California. So in 2016, we actually did that. We released our first candidate endorsements, and then took positions on ballot measures that were critical for environmental justice communities. Our big strategy is around looking at, in California, again, we're very unique in that we have a majority of people of color here, and our legislature is also a makeup of a majority of people of color to represent their constituencies. That does not mean that just because you're a person of color and you're an elected official that you are going to vote on our side, right? What does it mean to actually elect a progressive candidate? That's a really hard work that we're engaged in right now. I will mention one success story that we had because we've just been doing the electoral politics now for 2 years. And 2018 obviously is going to be a huge year. But we were engaged in the fight in one particular race, which was around Eloise Gomez-Reyes and taking down Cheryl Brown. So if people don't know, former Assemblymember Cheryl Brown, it was a black legislator, but she was in the pockets of big oil. She voted wrong on every environmental justice legislation. She voted wrong on criminal justice legislation. She voted wrong on healthcare. And so there was a united front to essentially take her down and vote up the progressive candidate, Eloise Gomez-Reyes, who is a Latina. So it became a black-brown issue, and it got played out as a black-brown issue. And we were the ones that had to dissolve that narrative, and we won in that race. So that's one example, and we're hoping to do much more of that. Thanks. And we're just getting started. It's very hard work, but yeah, that's our example.
So let's move on to the second question if we can, but I mean, that's great work, and I guess the answer is yeah, electoral politics are really important, right? Does anybody want to address the question of like the local versus more the national thing? And maybe we had a question on the webcast also about the alternative to the cap and trade type legislation, which even at the national level and whatnot, and some notion of like on the policy level, how these things play out between communities and on the national scale as well.
I'll defer to Aiko for that last one. But I'll take the one question. I just want to also add on the getting people to run. I think we want to be electing communities into office, not individuals. So I think that's a shift in thinking about it, because you're also building an accountability. So when people get into office, we hold them accountable. So just wanted to say that, because I think that's an emergent way of doing political training that's growing. On the piece though, with looking at communities that are actually being able to lead on renewable energy tend to have a lot more resources, have much more, whether it's economic wealth or renewable energy wealth, that's happening. So the one concern I got really nervous about after the election was the big rise up of the cities narrative. The cities, the cities are going to defend. The cities are going to resist. And it's like, yes, this is great, yes. And what about everyone else outside the cities who may not be in that bubble? Because again, there's this misconception that like the cities are the progressive spaces, and that's where all people of color are, and there's no one other than white people who live out in the suburbs and the rural communities, and that's just not true. And so there's a lot of people who have been marginalized and vulnerable and impacted in suburban and rural communities as well, that are kind of left out of that cities narrative. And we're kind of seeing this also with 100% cities, not counties, but 100% cities is a big push. And that you have this divide then. So for me, I don't know if this is one of the answers anyway that we've been talking about it in our work is really this, like, how do we do this from an urban, rural, suburban? Because there are resources and assets that, like space, we need to be able to scale for the renewable energy work. One, we have to decrease our consumption. And two, we need to have battery storage and different technologies, but we need to have some land to be able to do that. And how do we do that well? It's hard to do in urban areas that are completely developed. And so you can put solar on everyone's rooftop if you fix everyone's roofs and you make sure everything's all set. But that's still not going to get you there. So building those relationships, I think is really critical. So we have to do that. And that means there's policy implications because, at least in Pennsylvania, it's really hard to do any type of procurement or really hard to do any type of economic kind of agreements between urban, rural, suburban communities because each community has its own like set of rules and they kind of silo off. So we have to go through a lot of change at local legislation as well as state legislation to be able even to get there. We can't do community solar like you can in California. So there's lots of barriers, but I think that's the model. Is it's more of a regional economy where people are kind of tying in together, and you can actually then utilize the assets and the resources everyone has.
You have any thoughts, Aiko, before we go on to
Do you want me to answer the cap and trade question?
whatever, you're here, whatever you want to talk
okay.
to.
Do you want
No, you can answer anything,
Well, I think I'll use it as a way to drive my point, which is that, again, as I said, the way that we build a movement is to connect with people where they're at on these issues and to organize and do deep education. I think that, and that's how we make that transformational part of the work happen. I think as an organizer and someone out there, I don't think that a lot of the average people are like, yay, I want to talk about cap and trade. I mean, cap and trade is a mechanism by which you accomplish something, right? That is an example of how we have technologized the conversation, that if we could just figure out some mechanical, smarty policy way to kind of make this palatable kind of notion. And I would also say that on the kind of organizing side, the focus of a lot of our models, and I put some concern about energy, is that we focus a lot about the business interests in this space, how people can make money and how people can benefit financially. And all I would say is, if you can show to me, this is a challenge to you all, a transformative change in our country that was led by business and corporations, I will change, for good. I know there's other movements, but for good and for the public good, then I will change my opinion. But at this point, if our collective interest is for the greater public good, I don't see transformation change being led by even a business or, for that matter, clean energy business. It needs to come from the community. And when we talk to community about issues, they're not talking about technical policy approaches to how to solve a problem, especially one that makes not a lot of sense to people and takes too long to explain, but really where people are at. And I think when we stay there and we organize and educate and mobilize people, then that's when we'll be better positioned to win.
And a related question online to that. I'll do it.
So online, we have a question that says, do you think the Citizens Climate Lobby's fee and dividend policy has legs, or is it just another name for cap and trade?
I don't think it's another name for cap and trade. I think it's another way to create a palatable policy that isn't going to accomplish enough. This is a provision, as you all know, revenue neutral carbon tax that is supported by ExxonMobil, which is a big clue to me in terms of what it'll actually do to climate. And part of it is because the strategy is to put a price on carbon and then get a tax break somewhere else. And so in the kind of accounting of corporations, it's a boon, right? Because you basically sort of play this shell game, right? So I'll pay a tax here and give me one over here, and then in the middle, I'll just kind of charge consumers more money. So I do think that, again, we are constantly thinking about policies that are palatable, that we can like have bipartisan support of congressional members or policymakers, things that like the mainstream can sort of live with. The problem is those approaches aren't, again, going to put us at the level. We are talking about a significant challenge before us, climate change, or an energy transition. To accomplish that requires big, bold ideas. It's not going to be the can we get something that everyone can agree on moment. You're going to get what you get when you take that path. So I would put that in the same category, that our alliances and our work is between urban and suburban, people of color, environmental groups, the left. I mean, we have labor. I'm going to talk about workers. And so I just think that it's a missed opportunity for us to not come together more effectively to drive something that's more bold and more transformative.
Well, I can see that this conversation can go on for 3 hours. I'm going to just have to take one more because we're actually at the end of the time for this particular session. State your name and a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Woody Hastings, Center for Climate Protection, climateprotection.org. We have some materials on the table if folks want to get to know more about us. So Center for Climate Protection has been working 10 to 12 years on community choice energy. We now have in California a pretty strong movement, 9 operational agencies, a whole bunch of them to start next year, and community choice offers a pretty strong, promising prospect for energy democracy, EJ communities, and the like. So looking at a lot of these issues, and I think the question is probably mostly for Iko and Anthony, doing national organizing. There are only 7 states right now that even have community choice law, and it's not the flavor of community choice law like we have in California. So for the states where it makes sense, have you taken a look at maybe helping those states, organizing in those states to establish community choice law? There are some efforts to do that. They're pretty feeble, actually, from what I've seen. But to establish the kind of community choice law we'd like to see, use that as an organizing principle to then go into the communities, once they've got the law, and then establish CCAs in those areas. Thanks.
Okay, a question about democratizing energy through community choice.
Yes and yes. The 100% network, part of what we do is to try to share and replicate good ideas. And I actually get a little bit of pushback because I have California sharing so much in our space lately. And we've had Al join us in conversations with states across the country. Jessica Tovar on the team here has been doing a ton of work with the network. People are really eager to know. When we've hosted conversations around that topic, we have had a really high turnout rate. So it is something that people are interested in. I think that it's a compelling opportunity. And I think part of it from the frontline perspective is that it's an area that can feel very technical, and that you're up against a big utility and other big actors. So I think, again, it's really, there's just been more organizing happening in California. It's been a strategy that's been more as a vehicle to organize people. And so we just need to share the wealth. So we're working on it.
So I'm sorry to the folks that couldn't get their questions asked, but we want to try to stay on schedule. So first, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we're going to come back. I want to say that, a lot of the agenda today, this morning anyway, is framed around authors of the Energy Democracy book. So we'll have some more folks coming up in the next session talking really now on a much more local level about what bringing energy to the movement for justice means. So get up, chat with folks, but we'll get back in about 15 minutes. Remember, there's some cake, there's going to be books in the back, there's sponsor displays here, and anything else, feel free to ask. Thank you. Tara Marchand from the Emerald Cities Collaborative Oakland branch is going to be moderating this session, and I'll just just turn it over to you, Tara, and let you go. This is going to be an hour long, another 1 hour discussion and conversation that's much more focused on the local work that folks are doing. So thank you, everybody, and let's take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Al. And again, thank you all for coming on this beautiful day after a gorgeous rain, which we love to sort of wash away and bring clarity to our planet. And I'm really excited to moderate this panel. It's really going to be holding up these beautiful leaders, and they have a lot to say. And you know, this is a way of looking again at what's already what's already happened in the past that's being led in the future. Vivian, your thought yesterday has been raised a couple of times, which is there is no original idea. It's, you know, the implementation and it's the tools to which we bring it forward. And another idea that came up yesterday, this is the opening reception, was the seventh generations, the Iroquois thought that you have to really be accountable to the seventh generations that pass and the seven generations in the future. And I think what's really important about these beautiful people is that the movement building is about really weaving in what the knowledge of communities and people and culture from the past and bringing it forward to make future generations have a healthy and beautiful space. And I think that's one of the things that also I believe Vivian said that actually hit me last night about the book. You know, we have this beautiful book, and these authors, minus Carla, who's actually representing for Michelle, are giving stories that really are sort of a benchmark and a holding place for other people to read and to have as knowledge moving forward, because it's about sharing of information that helps us galvanize collectively and move forward. So each of these beautiful people have created amazing stories of their leadership within community, and they want to leave it for the next generation, for you to build your knowledge moving forward. So today what we're going to do is we're going to start with a big frame with Carla from Movement Generation, and then we're going to move to the more individual local stories that people have been guiding for the last decade. Vivian from APEN, Ashura from One Voice, and Jessica from Local Clean Energy Alliance. So just as a context and frame, each of these speakers will have 8 minutes. And then I have a little timer at 7:27. 7:25, actually. Sadly, I couldn't change the timer, so you might hear the song, which is Over the Rainbow. I tried to change that, but you know, hopefully I'll be able to sort of wave at you guys before that, and then you'll know you have about 75 seconds after that. And then really, I'll ask a couple questions, but I really feel your intelligence. If you have anything that you want to say, just, you know, raise that up. You know, I really want, you know, this is a pressing question, because this is how community organizing. It's not me telling you what to do. It's about us all riffing off each other and building it up. So within the context of the 8 minutes, the presentation will, to some degree, articulate the chapter that these speakers are brought to this book. But give a little context of your organization and then the chapter, and try to do that all within 8 minutes so that we can have a little more discussion and then Q&A from the floor. All right, great. So why don't you go ahead and start, Carla, and share.
Good morning. Good morning, Oakland. How are you? Good to see everyone today. I want to say thank you for inviting us, Movement Generation, via Michelle, to contribute to this book. And just really happy that this book is available for us to support us in moving towards and achieving energy democracy, and even more to help us, the movement, the general public, understand what energy democracy is. So I couldn't help but do a little fishing around for like what the sort of a mainstream understanding of energy democracy might be. So I just like typed it in over the internet and pulled up a few different things that were not coming from like a left organization. And what I consistently found was a description that said that energy democracy is a political, economic, social, and cultural concept that merges the technological transition of energy systems with a strengthening of democracy and public participation. And I was like, oh, doesn't sound bad. If I was a layperson, that would sound great. Technological transition of our industrial or electricity systems is really important, as is the democratization of these. The contribution that Movement Generation would like to make to this conversation is that in addition to democratizing, decentralizing, dampering down, and redistributing access to electricity, we also need to decolonize our relationship to something as cosmic and ancient as energy, right? And stop referring to it as if it only or even mostly lives in the industrial energy sector of this present-day dominant economy. Everything on Earth is derives its energy from the 4 basic elements. And the one we understand most in terms of producing energy is fire, right? The fire of the sun. This energy heats stones, it heats mountains, it warms the ocean, it moves microorganisms and bacteria, and it lives inside each one of us. It's inside each one of us. What are we doing with this energy? We have become experts at channeling and using it. Over the course of human life, our understanding and relationship to this energy has changed dramatically. And this is where we need to look at decolonizing. Before the dominant application of energy among people pre-modern times, the dominant application of our energy as people was concentrated in our relationships to each other, to the place that we're in, to our ecosystem partners, our cultural expression, our cosmology, and stewarding the bioregion that our peoples lived in. It looks much different now, no? And we have come with the diaspora of Western culture, we've come to focus our attention on one form and mostly one application of the sun's energy, and that's electricity, right? And I'm generalizing, I'm sure everyone understands that, but just to say. So in line with the mindset of compartmentalization and disintegration brought to us by the capitalist and the colonial project, in modern times and in our movement, we've focused the scope of problem solving, our problem solving efforts around electricity and energy as a sector in mostly one way also. And there's so many ways to understand energy than to limit it to electricity and fuel. And there's also so many ways to approach achieving energy than to only focus on the industrial energy sector as it is known today in our economy, yeah? So if we're thinking about just transition, then this is about whole systems thinking, and we have to broaden our view and our understanding of how we relate to something as critical and foundational as energy. But this is important, and we're here to talk about this. So as we all know, in the bigger ecosystem of our economy, housing, water, transportation, food systems, and the medical system, which is not one that we often talk about in these spaces or sectors of economy, these different sectors of our economy are completely dependent on the energy grid, right, that we're seeking to democratize, right? So there are some statistics that are put out in the book that are familiar to some and daunting to others, like that 20% of California's energy capacity is used by the water industry. And then somebody here must have the same. I was looking for a strong stat on our California's energy use in the farming industry, and I found lots of different things, but something between 20 and 30, which is still a huge amount, a percentage of our California energy. These sectors, when developed under the conventional economic model, they require lots and lots of human and ecological destruction, right? Huge amounts of capital, that also is dependent on historic and current forms of exploitation, removing mountaintops to access soil, drilling oil as far as 18 miles beneath the floor of the ocean. Things like this, right, in order to generate fuel and transport the electricity to the power grid. This energy is then deployed to power all of our other critical systems: housing development, water, food systems, medical system, and our transportation system. So as far as what Movement Generation is trying to do to address this, I wanted to mention that in 2009, MG launched a program called the Earth Skills Program. Can I see show of hands of people who know of or participated in our Earth Skills Program? Not enough people in the room. Okay, y'all better sign up on our listserv and come out to the next Earth Skills training. So this is a program whose intention was to provide a space where organized communities can practice restoring and managing their relationship to our own work, our own energy, and the resources that meet our basic needs, especially in ways that reconnect us to ancestral knowledge. And the ancestral instructions around how to steward home with integrity and reverence. And without using this language, the Earth Skills Program was launched absolutely to advance energy democracy. In this program, hundreds of community residents, community organizers, staff, and member leaders of environmental and social justice organizations gained skills in, I'll give you a not comprehensive list, but rainwater catchment systems, gray water installation, organic composting and soil amendment, beekeeping and harvesting honey, bike repair and rider safety, natural healing and wellness techniques, natural building, passive solar cooking systems, using adverse possession and changing doorknobs, important skill, rooftop garden installation, plant identification and plant medicine making, waterless toilets, yes, and come on, waterless toilets. And permaculture design skills, which I won't get into, but is a systems thinking, right, around design and relationship, around the way we relate elements in a system to each other. So cultivating and proliferating these types of earth skills is critical for energy democracy, right? So people remembering and relearning the skills to harvest and steward natural resources at an ultra-local scale where they can feel even the slightest failure in the system and are personally motivated to correct it immediately, says a lot, you know, and is how we need to be responsive and reflective, right, to the way we relate to energy and other resources, right? It also means that people can start to practice self-governance, which is critical, and then move our resources, including our own human labor, from extractive, harmful, and capitalist systems to local regenerative systems that are held by those in relationship to those elements, yeah? And who are impacted most by the way that they're stewarded. And then when you know, communities organized such as APENS communities and other communities take these practices and scale them up to the scale of a block, of a neighborhood, right, or more, then we can begin to impact the energy grid, right? And we can reject the false techno solutions, like replacing our whole energy grid with solar, replacing all our gas cars with hybrids, right? We can reject those technological fixes and instead practice the long lost art of TEK-no, of traditional ecological knowledge. And so in the book, we focused on examples from Richmond, that I'll just run through quickly of how organizations there are moving energy democracy in these less conventional ways in terms of how we think about energy. So we talked about urban tilth, acquiring land, and teaching the ancient art of agroecology and sustainable farming. Rich City Rides, which is growing the two-wheel transportation system, right, and creating an alternative to driving in the shadow of Chevron. CBE and the Building Blocks for Kids Collaborative, taking healing and wellness of their members that suffer serious impacts from exposure to pollution into their own hands. Cooperation Richmond, helping people regain control of their own labor, how they use it, et cetera. Right? So when we have, well, how much time do I have? Okay, so I can save some more maybe for the talk afterwards, but What we were talking about in preparation for this conference was that our solution to the energy crisis cannot simply be to decarbonize the economy, but it also must decolonize the economy and our relationship to energy, starting with decolonizing our understanding and relationship to energy. We should all be applying our energy to heal from the colonization of the sun. As a grassroots ecologist, I really sit with the fact that energy is a diverse spectrum of vibrations that gives form and function to everything and all life. Electricity is but one of those vibrations on the spectrum, and we've zoomed into it and become experts on sparking it, channeling it, and using it, putting it to use, mainly to power electronic devices. However, the forms in which energy can express itself are vast and so very incredibly diverse, ranging from the power of a massive lightning bulb to the energy a little tiny ant has to exert to move a grain of sand. And we, as people, use that same kind of energy as the ant every day, and it can be applied to do so much more than correct electrical systems in order to meet modern needs while we advance energy democracy. Thank you.
Okay, so I've got a new timekeeper, because I was hoping my little alarm would indicate to you that it was time, but it didn't go off. So what I'm going to do is when it is 7 minutes, I'm going to, and then when you have about 15 seconds left, I'm going to go again, all right? Because these women have done so much amazing work, and there's so much to tell. But we do want to have an engagement of how we're interrelated. I mean, we are an ecosystem. People are working individually and collectively, so we really want those ideas to be cross-pollinated within this little context as a reflection of what we have to do out there in community.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Vivian Huang with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. And I wanted to shout out to that with the chapter in the book, I also had a co-author, Mia Yoshitani, who's the executive director at our organization. And she, unfortunately, is out of town, so wasn't able to be here today. Yeah, but as a way to get started, I thought it might be helpful to actually just invite everyone in the room to reflect on a life experience that you personally had that really motivated you to fight for justice, right? So it could be something recent, it could be something from your childhood, but just take a moment to kind of just reflect on a moment that really, I think, grounds you in your purpose and why you're on this path to be at this part of this movement today. So my experience that I usually go back to is being a child growing up in an immigrant family, right? So my parents are both immigrants, and they also sponsored other family members to come to the U.S. And so I think really growing up in that experience, I think really shaped me a lot, right? So I saw kind of a lot of the, like the loss that people experience, and having to leave their homelands and kind of adapt to a new culture. I also saw a lot of the injustice that immigrant communities face, from the systems here and from having to kind of adapt to a new type of life here in the U.S. And I think that experience has really grounded me in my own personal life to really want to work with immigrant and refugee communities. And so at APEN, those are the populations and communities that I am working with. We organize locally here in Oakland, in Chinatown, we're right in the heart of Chinatown, with Chinese immigrants who are Cantonese and Mandarin speaking. And then we also organize in Richmond with the Laotian refugee community that fled the wars in Southeast Asia and ended up in Richmond. And we also organize Asian American youth, right, that come from many, many different ethnic groups within kind of the Asian American family. So, in terms of my life stories, that I initially actually went to do a lot of policy and advocacy work. So I was actually working on like legislation issues in Sacramento for immigrant rights and language access. And I think that in doing that work, I really recognize kind of the limitations of only working on like a campaign that was addressing a particular fix in a particular moment. And so what I felt was really lacking was, I think, the need to really create more longer term and more deep kind of organizing and base building that would actually have impact over the long term, right? And so that's actually why I came to APEN, because I found it so important that, that we were actually really building a movement, so that it wasn't just about getting like this particular bill passed in Sacramento or this policy passed at City Council, but that we were actually working with community to actually build power that would actually have impact over the long term. So one of the things at APEN that I think is really important is the idea of like how do we actually build power, right? And I think that in our energy democracy movement, it's so important to think about how do we actually build power in deep ways. And so at APEN, I think the focus is really, we're grounded and we're rooted in this idea of base building, which is that connection and relationship building that happens one-on-one with people, that brings them in to be connected to kind of a larger movement and larger base of people, and then to actually have their leadership be supported and developed, right? So that community members are actually utilizing their own power, right? To actually fight against injustice and to actually put forward like the solutions that they want to see in community. And so one quote that I heard recently was really meaningful to me was just thinking about how leadership is about knowing your life story, right? And so I think that's something at APEN that we really want to highlight and lift up, is that leadership is not, it's not like certain people are born with leadership and others are not, right? That's a completely kind of false idea that's sometimes put out by kind of the dominant mainstream narrative, you know, but really this idea that leadership is something that all of us possess, right? And that, and it's about connecting kind of our life values and story to what we would like to see happen, and having agency in making those decisions to make social change in our society. And so the way we do that is that we actually provide kind of a variety of different ways that people can actually be engaged in our movement work, and also different ways that people can develop their own leadership and their own power, right? And so it's everything from actually going through like a concrete training program. We run a kind of a leadership institute that's called the APEN Academy, where people actually come and can learn about different skills and different concepts related to environmental justice and ecological justice. But it also looks like having to, you know, show up and testify at a hearing, going to Sacramento, having to face down, you know, super powerful corporations as opponents, right? In a lot of ways, those experiences are just as transformative and just as important as kind of the trainings and the trainings and the opportunities kind of learn more in a more traditional setting, right? And so it's really the combination of really having both, I think, the knowledge and the skills and the values, but also the experiences to really put them into practice. And then I think that a lot of times the question that I get is like, well, how can you really build power if you're working so deeply with individuals? Okay, and so I think that what I want to push back on is thinking about how do we build scale by fostering greater connections between communities all over the country that are going deep in their communities, right? So that it's not just about an organization saying that they represent like a whole state or whole country, but actually having communities who are deeply rooted be connected with other communities that are deeply rooted, and forming that web that actually spans a much greater area. And so that's why we're part of many alliances, part of many movement spaces, because we believe in the value of making those connections between our community with others that are also facing similar injustices and advocating for similar solutions. And then lastly, I think I'll just close with by saying that I think in this conversation about how do we achieve power, not just energy power, but also economic and democratic power for our communities, is that there's this need for us to all be focused on how do we really build and organize more and really develop leadership within ourselves and within our communities. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ashura Lewis, and I'm with One Voice from Jackson, Mississippi. Most of you probably haven't heard of us because we're brand new to this energy democracy game, but we've had some, success in the past year, and we'd like to share that with you. But before I even get into what we've been doing, I don't expect everyone in the room to have the breakdown and statistics of Mississippi. So I will give you the short version of it. Everything comes down to race. Everything. You could probably find a pack of gum that's slightly different from one neighborhood to the other, and it will somehow be tied to race. That is that systemic. And so when we look to, what is our next issue, our next ballot initiative, our next, project or program, it's not hard to find anything. And even with that being said, energy democracy was not on our radar, not at all. And so we have ties to the NAACP, which has a wonderful, statewide and southern-wide connection, particularly, that we can lean on when we go into the communities. And it was this advantage that gave us the opportunity that when we went to the communities, particularly in the Delta, and discovered they had serious concerns about their electricity provider. In this instance, it was electric cooperatives. And personally, I had no idea what electric cooperative was. I got a crash course in that very quickly. But the basic idea for those that might not know also is instead of a privately owned company or municipal, city, county-owned company, this is a cooperative which services all the participants, but if you pay a bill, you end up being a member and an owner. You are part of that cooperative structure. You have power in that structure. Unfortunately, most of the people in Mississippi, particularly people of color, had no idea that that was the case. They just paid a bill. And in most cases, it was a whopping bill, sometimes up to 40% and plus of their income, just on electricity, not utilities, just electricity. And so with that in mind, we had to start looking at, okay, this is what their concerns are. What can we do to help mitigate some of these things? I mean, other than just, pray and wish and hope the board changes overnight, which, by the way, does not work. So we looked at what we do well, what we've known has worked, what the history of organizing Mississippi has revealed to us, and that's two major concepts. One, that One Voice looks to the history of organizing in Mississippi particularly, but in the South and during the Civil Rights Movement. And what always worked was instead of an egocentric movement, I didn't do that. Instead of an egocentric movement, it was a community-centric movement. We can't go in and fix this for them. We will show them this is, the resources you have, the tools you have, go fix it yourself, because they're the ones that also know the solution. So that was always, frame one. Frame two was almost every solution that can truly work and be sustainable was based on the idea of education. You may know that there's a problem, but you may not know the nuances, the resources, the tools, the legal avenues, all those things available to you. So that was where we kind of filled in the gap for that. And so in this particular instance, we already had success with our Mississippi Black Leadership Summit that was running, I think at that time, 7 or 8 years going, where it just collects Black and people of color leaders from all over the state and share best practices in a variety of areas. We had already had our Mississippi Black Leadership Institute, which does the same thing, except it's a training course that you have to apply for, and it lasts 9 months, and they receive training on how to work with, municipal governments and how to get grants for this, that, and the other, water infrastructure, whatever it may be. So we took that same idea and applied it to the electric cooperative sense, and we came up with our Electric Cooperative Leadership Institute. Long name for a simple concept. What we did is, without application, we just invited members of 9 different cooperatives across the state, which accounted for roughly 35% of the population of Mississippi and well over half of the electric cooperative population. We invited them in, and for 6 months, they meet once a month. We pay for their hotel and food. They come to us and spend a day with us, and we go over the rules, the responsibilities, the rights, and the resources you have as a member owner. The first step in that process, though, was always, for me, the most satisfying, frustrating, and inspiring all at the same time, which is when we invite them in and we ask how do you feel about your electric, service provider, and have you ever been to an annual meeting, and have you ever cast a vote? And they're like, no, I didn't know I could do any of that. And well, we have no trouble over our rates, and have you ever gotten a refund? No, I haven't seen a refund. I'm supposed to get a refund? And then we drop that bomb on them that you own that power company. And you could literally hear a pin drop in the room, and then it would erupt like, what? I own what? And that was pretty much the discussion the entire day. Like, what do you mean I own something? What do you mean, do I own it? And so we'd have to explain, this is a nonprofit. They can't make money because it's your business. So any profit goes to you. They're like, I haven't seen any profit. We know. That's why we're here. And so I know in Mississippi in 2000, let me call it 7, but you can double check me, my chapter in the book, that there were several millions of dollars that was unaccounted for that never made it back into the member owners' hands. There are electric cooperatives that haven't seen a refund since the 1930s. There are some that have seen some since the 80s, but it'll be $200, $50, and that will be their annual thing, and that's all they get. So once they discover that they have, some stake in this, some actual viable, usable interest in this, we have their attention, and we spend the next, 5 to 6 sessions going over things like, what is transparency when it comes to corporate finance? What are you entitled to know as an owner? How do you request the 990s? How do you interpret where this money's going? Not the most fun session, but we do what we can. We also have a bylaw session. Personally, that's mine. I'm actually missing teaching that session to be here with you today. But we explain to them in the sense that I have a legal background, and even I find bylaws boring. And so I tried to not make it boring for them, but we go over, if you were going to sit down and play a new game that's, let's say, as complicated as Monopoly, but not quite the same, and no one told you the rules, do you think you could win at the game? And see, that's something they can understand. And just to drive home that point, because we like being physical, we actually give them one group a set of bylaws, and the other group doesn't get a copy. And they have the job of stopping the incumbent from being reelected to the board and electing one of their own. But this group that doesn't have the bylaws usually sits there frustrated because they're doing all the common sense things of, I'll raise my hand, I'll nominate this person. But the bylaws don't allow for that. The bylaws say you have to jump up and down 3 times and say abracadabra before you allow someone to be nominated. And the whole point of it is to teach them, no matter how silly it is, no matter how convoluted it is, the bylaws are the law. They're the rules of the game, and they have stacked the rules against you. And so we teach them how to use those rules in their favor. And then this all culminates at the end of the 6 weeks with them coming up with their own campaigns. Some of them are just campaigns to further educate members of the cooperative. Some of them actually are considering board runs. And in those cases, we also offer technical support, for anyone that wants to launch that kind of campaign. But the entire concept is based in, it is their investment into their own cooperative, into their own community that helps shape that future. And we are just there to support them and to educate them and give them the tools and resources and access. And I see that my time is up, but that's okay. So I'll sum up with this, that was started last year. We already finished our first cohort. We are in the middle of our second cohort now, which the numbers in some electric cooperatives have doubled. So the word is spreading and we're getting more participation. We've already had 2 members apply for grants from their cooperative, and we're able to fund repairs to a community college and to a park, and we have 2 others that are considering board runs. So we're really excited about what this next year could bring.
So I'm Jessica Tovar. I'm with the local Clean Energy Alliance and also the coordinator of the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. So I'd like to take a few steps back and talk a little bit about my personal experience, where I'm from. I'm from East Los Angeles. I grew up near the city of Vernon, which is an all-industrial city, a major boulevard of heavy diesel traffic. Literally the housing projects that I lived in would shake every time these huge diesel trucks would drive by. Lots of industry, a whole lot of polluting industry, namely crematoriums for animal carcasses, human bodies, several other types of industry, including fossil fuel power plants. And, you know, when I think back to, you know, my community and the context of, you know, just really understanding how all that toxic soup contributed to health problems in my community, on top of just the lack of employment. And, you know, I grew up with a single mom who had a hard time paying the bills. And oftentimes the power would be out because my mom couldn't meet that demand, right? That constant revolving debt. So that was my relationship to energy. And for a good 10 years, I spent a lot of my life doing organizing around polluting industry because of this personal experience. I did work around the PG&E Hunters Point power plant in Bayview Hunters Point, a lot of work. Chevron oil refinery in Richmond for years. And it was always fighting, right? It's fighting these huge corporations. And oftentimes I'd be asked, well, what are the solutions that, you know, we need to address around pollution? And, you know, I feel like I best represent a lot of these communities that I work in, because it takes time, right, to learn these connections. And I'm really thankful that at the Local Clean Energy Alliance, we've really focused on being holistic and working with different communities and leadership from other sectors that are fighting injustice. Folks working in the housing issues, folks working on energy issues, climate issues, environmental justice issues, you know, folks trying to do more economic justice, working with the labor movement, and really bringing all these different sectors together to really identify, well, what are the solutions that we need? So this is all the work that we try to address through community choice energy. And so one of the things that's really important is that, you know, we kind of organize and have these different kind of, I want to say like visionary kind of meetings that we call Clean Power to the People. And a lot of that has been focused on, well, what are the solutions that we want to see in our community, right? And specifically through community choice energy, you know, we actually been fighting for years. Before I even came on to Local Clean Energy Alliance, there's been a lot of advocacy to get a community choice energy program started. How many of you live within Alameda County right now? Show of hands. Okay, a lot of you. How many of you are aware that next year in 2018, June of 2018, we're going to have a community choice program called East Bay Community Energy? Excellent. Okay, so that is a program that we actually advocated for years and years. And we actually, I want to just acknowledge what Kirsten and other folks said last night. People thought we were nuts. A lot of people didn't support us. Even some allies, some would-be allies, I would say, wouldn't support us in a lot of the work that we have done. But it's just really important because right now, there are a lot of community choice programs in the state of California, and we're very critical of community choice. Community choice in itself, of the way it's being done, is not ideal. It is buying energy off of the market and then reselling it. And if that's all you're doing, you're not doing any better than PG&E or any other IOU, investor-owned utility. What we need to do is actually push to have that clean energy infrastructure built within our community, and I'm talking about wind, I'm talking about solar. And it's not just about if you own your home and you have the money that you can slap on some panels. That's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about families. I'm talking about renters. I'm talking about these communities that have been dumped on for decades by the energy system, the dirty energy system, the PG&E power plants, the Chevron oil refineries, and all the other industrial polluting companies in our communities, right? So we really are advocating for a lot of clean energy job creation in our community, and we actually convinced the Board of Supervisors in Alameda County that we need to do more with community choice, and they made a commitment that over the next 10 years, they will start to be investing in more clean energy infrastructure through our Community Choice Energy Program. And you should be very proud of that because it's the first program that has committed to that from the very beginning. And we see that as super important because we can't be relying on the market, right? We can't be relying on the market for our energy because that's just money going out the door, out of our communities somewhere else. We need to keep that wealth circulating within our communities. We're facing like hyper gentrification, right? And just so many people being displaced from the Bay Area and really acknowledging, you know, when we're advocating for local hire, it's like, hey, wait a minute, a lot of local people born and raised in the Bay Area are not living in the cities that they were born in, right? So we're also thinking just really outside of the box. How do we prioritize, you know, long-term Oaklanders, for example, to get them into these training programs and actually create pathways that lead to jobs, right? So that's another issue is we're training all these people. There are no jobs, and then the jobs they do get are $15 an hour for installing solar. That's not sustainable for families, right? So other things that we learned along the way is with Community Choice Energy, you're talking about aggregation. Aggregation means pooling different sizes of projects, large, medium, and small. Imagine a giant warehouse with solar panels, right? And adding that up with a lot of smaller buildings. When you have a certain amount of megawatts, you can actually unionize or get family-sustaining wage jobs out of large projects, right? So that's one of the things that we've been talking about and learning along the way because this is work that has not been done. It's pretty precedent-setting, I want to say. So working with different sectors, we had gotten about 60 organizations to sign on in those different sectors and really getting folks to advocate for their communities, and advocate for the people that they work with, you know, formerly incarcerated folks, trying to get them trained to do this work, and just really putting our heads together for talking about and figuring out, well, how can we use this community choice program to create those opportunities. So jobs not only in solar and wind, but also energy efficiency. So that's something that I'm out of time, but I just want to just acknowledge, you know, for somebody like me and a lot of people that I've worked with along the years, energy really has been at the crux of our problems, socioeconomic, environmental, and it's also at the crux of our solutions in our community, and that's really what we're focusing on. So thanks very much for your time.
So I really want to thank the rattle. It's an old technology, but it's a good one. And I actually want to, I guess that's probably my first question because there's such a variety of things happening here. And when I looked at the morning plenary, it's what bringing energy to the movement for justice means. And I'm hearing so many different ways that you guys are applying you know, tools of training, you know, leaderful opportunities of having people look at the past and acknowledging what, you know, what was designed in the past, create ownership. So there's all these ways in which things from the past are coming into the future. And so my question to you is, you know, what is showing up within the knowledge of your elder community and the eldership, whether or not it's immigrants, whether or not it's from family, that is becoming a new, that's being brought into a new light. I was laughing because it's like, everyone's like, oh, Uber's so cool and intelligent, Airbnb. It's like, these are all old practices. A new technology has brought them forward. So my curiosity to you and your community is what is being brought into the movement that's having new life.
I'll jump in first. I can only speak for the communities that I've personally visited, and what I've seen to follow along your question that's come from the past is kind of being pushed forward now within our electric cooperative work. It's actually more of a cultural kind of way you've been raised, or at least I know it's the way I was raised, and it has been lost before, but it's kind of gaining new ground again in the African American community in the Delta, Mississippi, and that's the concept of, if it's part of your community, it's part of your family. And if it's part of your family, you represent it well. And like I said, that was something that was used in my house, sometimes literally beaten into me. But it's coming back in the sense that it's being applied now outside of just, your neighborhood or your house, or even the church, which is one of the mainstays that it kind of always remained with. But now it's being applied to their ownership of the cooperative. And so they're not just seeing it as a name and maybe a refund check. They're seeing it as an extension of all the life lessons they got from their mother and their father and their grandmother as part of something they have to maintain. It's part of the family code and the family honor, and it's part of their way of, if not necessarily escaping the community, but improving the community that they're in, so they don't have to escape. And that I've seen that kind of cultural, ownership emerge faster than I think if we didn't have the trainings and hadn't gone in there.
I think just building off of that, what I thought of was just how much our Khmu and Mien members in Richmond actually talk about kind of their way of life back in the village in Laos, and how the idea of collective ownership and kind of collective caretaking was what they actually lived by, right? And so I think now that as we're talking about, how do we transition to a regenerative living economy, and so many of the ideas encompassed in that is about how do we have sort of collective ownership and caretaking, right, of our natural resources, right, whether it's land or water or air or energy. And so I'm just always reminded that value is such an old one, right, that has a history and an experience that already exists. And so it's how do we actually take what people have long been doing and make it more of the way of life for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads me something you brought up, which is this collective interdependence, and this goes back to the question or the presentation that Carla was saying about ecosystems. Our way of learning in the capitalist world is competitive, singular, and ecosystems are codependent, and yet that doesn't mean things are equal, right? Because if you look in an ecosystem, you might have just a little of this herb and a big tree, and the big tree gets a lot of light. So my question is, when you're talking about cooperation and equity, how do you hold the space where doesn't mean everyone gets exactly the thing, but the collective has a larger role, that where you are actually owning something larger than the individual piece? So how are you presenting that to communities?
Well, I'll just add, through this Community Choice Energy Program, East Bay Community Energy, a lot of what we fought for has also been just community at the center of, the design of the program. And we actually had fought to get leaders in the community to be on the board of the program. But as was mentioned earlier, under California law, only electeds can be on a joint powers authority board. So we advocated for what we could get, and we got a community advisory committee. And everybody knows that when you get a community advisory committee, it's really a struggle about having teeth, right? We've actually, and this is where this is really hopeful, is that a lot of people say, community advisories, they don't have any power. The Community Advisory Committee for the East Bay Community Energy is made up of 9 folks from our community, and they've had huge influence on how East Bay Community Energy program moves forward, and really have pushed back on the board, have pushed back on Nick Chassett, the CEO, and pulled the brakes when things are moving in a bad direction, where, for example, the call center, if they're gonna do a higher contract on that, we wanna make sure that that call center is here within the county and hires local people, so just things like that, which are decisions being made, we really, really have been influential on that. So I just wanted to just share that short tidbit with you, so.
Great. I'd love to respond in a way that that also speaks to the last question a little bit. So just want to thank you for those examples, and I was thinking similarly, what we've inherited from the people that have come before us are the very kind of I'm calling them earth skills. There's just like the way of life, right? We didn't have an academic framework for it. You collected water because that's what made sense. Because before you had access to big industrial tools, you weren't if you had access to a well, that was fairly there were simple technologies that would allow you to access a well. But absent that, or if you didn't want to, or it wasn't smart to drill into the ground wherever you were in your particular place, you collected rainwater in all kinds of different ways. You collected food. You shared the distribution of your labor, of energy through your own labor. Everyone participating in harvesting, everyone participating in sharing that abundance. So we've had, we have a strong history of a direct relationship where our labor comes into an intimate contact with the resources. Resources, I don't know. I struggle with this language, this academic industrial language, resources, the elements with the sacred things that make life possible for us. That's just, feels more comfortable for me to say it that way. And then our use of it was collective as well. And in terms of how that bridges to some of the programs that you both spoke to right now, how do we move people towards embodying equity without it being a struggle? In these, old but new ways that we're coming in to steward resources. I'm not sure how to go about that without doing some of that decolonizing, that political education, and that healing. I mean, you said it. It is as much as our minds can intellectualize what's wrong with everything we've inherited and that's been ingrained with us in the system. The bridge or the space between that intellectual understanding and us actually being able to own a different truth in ourselves and act that way, like understanding equity, that it's not just like, let's all get the same slice of the pizza. Sorry, Kirsten, everyone keeps referring to you. So like Kirsten and her good old reference to the slice of pizza pie. Why equity matters. What does it mean? What are the different things that factor into how and why different people in the same community get a different amount of something or participate in a different way? That physical laboring is not the only thing, neither is intellectualizing, are not the only things that contribute to our system. So I think even as a left conscious movement around energy and resources and reconnecting to the earth, we tend to use really strong language around ability, assumptions around ability and value around that kind of ability. And I think there's a lot of healing that we need to do that expands even to that as well. What are the elders' contributions? They're not laboring away with pickaxes. What are the infants' contributions? What are the little ones' contributions? They're not intellectualizing about it. We're learning from them all the time. And so I think, bringing together these cultural pasts that we have and some revisiting of the healing work that we need to do from these things that are ingrained in us will allow us to play these really well-designed systems out in a way that's equitable and righteous.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's just really that frame of the 7 generations back and the 7 generations forward, and what is our role as we move through life? How do we own what is next to lead the upcoming generation, our youth? How do we become elders in a way that we can be teachers? And how do we take these amazing movements and have them to continue? So we do have some questions online. No? Okay, so I was go to the questions online. So we don't have questions online. So I'm curious about how are the youth coming in? Because, they don't pay the electric bill. They don't even see the bill when they come. How are the youth in these different communities finding their own innovative way to voice this struggle, and how are you collectively lifting that up to the community?
So I could speak a little bit to that, and it's not a lot of work that I've been doing focused on the youth. It's mostly been Colin and Corinne who had done work and built relationships with high schools, specifically Street Academy, and hosting youth over the summer and really giving them a lot of political education and a lot of forums in our community to testify to City of Oakland, to Alameda County. And a lot of what, we're talking, what we have talked to the youth about is look, we're advocating for a system that you're gonna live in, that you're growing up in, that we wanna see you thrive in, and that creation of jobs, and preparing you for that and fighting for that is very important. And so that's some of the work, a lot of the work actually that Colin and Corinne had done with the youth. And I just step in here and there to do a little training or, get them to paint the banner, the Clean Power to the People banner in the back of the room. So that's how we've been talking about a lot of these issues. And a lot of folks relate to it, even though they're not paying a bill. They're using electricity way more than I did when I was a teenager. So they know. So I just wanted to add that.
Just real quickly, I want to say that in our first year, we didn't really focus on youth, but that became a problem as the youth came to us once again. And we discovered that their concern, of course, were jobs, whether it be a summer job or post-high school or if they make it to college, post-college. And most of the African-American, particularly males we've seen, would comment to us, there are no linemen, electric linemen that look like them. And that's where the big money is, at least in these rural areas. And so now we are looking to possibly adding a leadership component on how to, look at your academic path to get into those jobs. In addition, we're also coming up with, or at least I'm supposed to be coming up with, lesson plans, elementary, middle school, and high school to give to science teachers that kind of introduce the concepts of technology, clean energy, green energy. So they're kind of exposed to this all along the way, so it's part of their natural educational process. So that's one of the things that we're looking into in the second year.
I was just going to add a quick point about how I think with our youth at APEN, just another reminder that so many of our issues are intersectional, and so they, are definitely concerned about climate justice because of the world that they have to grow up in. But then our youth, in terms of the issues that they really want to prioritize, it was really looking at state repression and sort of state violence, related to, immigrant youth as well as youth of color. And so I think it's just another reminder about how do we also make our movements much more intersectional so that we're actually building bridges and connections with a lot of other issues that people are facing in communities very directly.
So example I'll draw from recently is, did anybody hear about the zombie march on coal to Phil Tagami's house? Right on. So I want to give it up to Climate Workers, which is run by Brooke Anderson, another member of Movement Generation. And the ones who took leadership, who actually shaped that, was their idea, were several classrooms of high school students from East Oakland, right? And so they came up with that idea to put together a zombie march the day before Halloween that would march up to Phil Tagami's house, who's suing the city of Oakland right now for the No on Coal ban that was put in place so that he could build a coal terminal right here in Oakland that would move coal from the southwest to the Chinese coast. So, you know, it was their design. They showed up. They spoke on the mic. They held a carnival outside of his house. They did trick-or-treating and leafleted his neighbors and offered treats and tricks of, treats of information about Phil Tagami's tricks in Oakland. And they're working, through their unionized teachers with other unionized labor forces to move this a ban on coal, not only a ban on coal, but an investment in clean energy here in Oakland.
Awesome, for the youth. So we're going to take a question from an elder who's at our mic. Would you please introduce yourself?
An elder, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I gather, Jessica in particular, that you're not in favor of the big solar farms that are being formed down in the desert. And instead of that, you're looking at local generation. And can you give some examples of the kind of local generation that you look for the East Bay Clean Energy setting up in Alameda County?
Yeah, we don't advocate for those solar in the desert. I think that goes back to there's this perception that nobody's in the desert and therefore put all the solar panels there. Actually, people, and there's life in the desert. Of all kinds. In addition to that, that's not the infrastructure in our communities, that's not the money in our communities. So just to acknowledge that we really, really seek it to be local for us here in our community. And so the other part of your question was what are the projects?
Local examples?
Oh, local examples. So again, this is not the work I'm totally focused on. Megan O'Neill from Local Clean Energy Alliance has really been spearheading a East Bay shared solar collaborative. So we're really trying to get a shared solar program. It's kind of like, I want to say a side project, but at the same time, it could be part of the community choice program. We really want it to be, but we're trying to get a project off the ground. And that's so that a community like East Oakland, for example, can all own and run this shared solar program. So one thing I just want to acknowledge is that with that, and with the East Bay Community Energy Program, there's still, it seems like putting solar is pretty benign, but it's still very political, difficult, and slow, right? So it requires a lot of patience. So that's something that we're really struggling with right now, but that's an example of what we would like to see more microgrids, more resiliency in the community, and ownership on that level too, right? And it would be awesome to see the excess that's produced from that being sold into the local program, and folks in our communities benefiting from that in that way as well. So that is something that we're working on as well.
Give it up for this amazing group. Sorry, we don't have any more time for any other questions. Again, we have this book, which I can't remember where I put it, but there it is, where you can get more details on the beautiful work that each of these organizations are doing and how to cross-pollinate and gain the insight that these organizations over decades have designed and developed, and to broadcast that through whatever system that is across the country. I'm sure, like Ashura, who's new here, is learning, like there's some partners and there's some learning here, and how can we help people who are trying to, create fertility in the soils of their community where new things can grow? How do we collectively integrate and weave our knowledge from the past into the future to a biosphere that we want? So thank you all, ladies, for being bright flowers in the soil. Thank you.